And I'm glad to introduce our speaker today, Dr. James Keach. Dr. Keach is the Assistant Extension Agent Faculty for Ornamental Crops on the island of Kaua'i in the University of Hawaii system. His background is in plant breeding with a focus on the use of crop, wild relatives, and underutilized crops in the tropics. He is also an associate judge with the American Orchid Society and has been thoroughly hooked on orchids since he was a kid. And when not pollinating plants, he enjoys reading and traveling. So, everyone, let us all welcome Dr. James Keach. Sir James?
Thank you so much for that introduction. I really appreciate it. I'm gonna share my screen right now and hope that this works all right. So again, thank you for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation to speak. I was saying as we were kind of waiting and setting up that I've heard so much throughout my academic career about UPLB. That's a true honor to be able to come and speak to you all today. When I was approached about what I wanted to speak about, I thought, oh, like, what can I talk about that really encompasses kind of this theme of biodiversity that you all are addressing in your seminar series? And my fallback is kind of how I got hooked on plants, which is orchids. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about orchid diversity and what we deal with in breeding. I'm going to try to give a few case examples, some things that have implications in terms of conservation, species integrity, but also just show a lot of pictures of what different species look like when combined together. So I thought I'd start out just on this opening slide. This is Cattleya bicolor crossed with Cattleya purpurata, and these are the parents of the photos of the actual parents. When you combine these species together, you end up with Cattleya sappho, and you can see down here at the bottom some variation within this cross. And so this is kind of going to be the ongoing theme, is how much variation there is within orchids and different ways that folks have kind of utilized that over the years. I'll be going over what an orchid is. I know we have folks from a wide range of backgrounds here today, talking about what a species is and kind of how orchids sidestep that a little bit. Talking about orchid names and some of the conventions there, because they can be different even than what we're used to hearing for horticulture and botany. And then giving some examples of orchid hybrids, both ways that kind of things got started with orchid breeding, some main themes for some 3 selected types of orchids, and then just a quick thing at the end about some trends that I'd like to see or that I see kind of happening. So first, I wanted to start out with what is an orchid? How do we differentiate these from other plants that we're familiar with? There's a few traits that kind of can tell you at a glance that it's an orchid. The most noticeable one is going to be the lip. Lip is basically a modified petal, but it's distinct from the other petals, as you can see here. In slipper orchids, which are different types, instead of a lip, they have a pouch, but it's the same principle, basically. So the presence of a lip or pouch is one thing. Fused carpels and stamens is another. So orchids have what's called a column in a lot of cases. Instead of all the different reproductive parts being separate, they fuse together, and the pollen actually undergo a different sort of fusion, end up as these hard sacs called pollinia. I think, when we think of pollen, we're used to something light and feathery. This is hard, and this is meant to kind of stick on to something. It still has lots of pollen grains within it. It's capable of creating, as I'll discuss in a little bit, millions of plants. But instead of each, pollen grain being distinct and born on the air or dusting an insect, these are sort of adhered instead. Orchids also typically are resupinate. And resupinate normally means that there's a twist to the flower when it's developing. In the case of orchids, most of them, it'll be resupinate in that the lip will be kind of facing the ground. And the rest of the plant will be kind of lined up along that. And sort of in that same vein, you'll see bilateral symmetry in all orchid flowers. That is, if we put a line down the center and kind of reflected it over that line, it would look more or less identical. And then finally, and I'll be getting to this more in future slides, orchids have very tiny seeds. So in addition to having kind of distinct pollen, orchid seeds are typically about the size of a speck of dust, if we think of it. This is a 20 Singaporean cent coin, so not the best example, but barely visible to the naked eye, not something with a lot of reserves, like we're used to thinking of with like maize, for instance, or even more so like a coconut. So like any rule, there are exceptions, and I'll try to name at least a few of them up front. I mentioned the creation of a lip. Orchids also have something called peloria. And this is, historically, my understanding is the etymology of the word comes from monster, but it's where one of the floral organs is modified. In this case, it's either the lip is modified to end up looking like a petal, like we see on Dendrobium coranda classic here, or the opposite, where the petals are modified to look like a lip. And so in this case, you still have kind of that presence of that area where a lip or petal would be, but the organ's been replaced. I've also mentioned the resupinate nature of orchids, the way that they twist. There are orchids that are non-resupinate. These were kind of the two examples that popped to mind, so I just thought I'd include them. Persicea cochleata, or the cuttlefish orchid, is one where the lip kind of faces upwards. And then Laelia leontii is another one. Laelia leontii is not nearly as common as Persicea cochleata, but I wanted to show it as an example of sometimes how diversity can sort of address some of these breaking of the rules. So if we take Laelia leontii, which is non-resupinate, and we cross it with Calarthron bicornutum, which is resupinate, the hybrid we end up with, and this is a hybrid, coincidentally, I happen to make, ends up being resupinate. So it appears that there's some dominance of this. And that sort of speaks to the general theme, right? You're going to expect these exceptions to the rule to not be something that's going to be controlled by a dominant gene or set of genes. So then getting on into what is a species, and this is going to kind of underlie a lot of things that orchids break the rules with. So typically when we're thinking about a species, in any case, but especially in plants, we're thinking about populations in which two individuals within that population can produce fertile offspring together. And that word fertile is key here. There might be geographical distinctions, sometimes they name the ranges based on it. And it's important to remember with all of this that these are basically construction that we're putting onto biology. This is not how the plants kind of sort themselves out. And so kind of classic example, and the only non-orchid example I'm going to really be talking about today, is Capsicum annuum. So this is like your typical hot chili. And then Capsicum chinense, like a habanero. These are in the same genus, they're in capsicum, they're different species. And because of that, you can try to make a hybrid of these, but chances are, you could get it, but it's not going to be fully fertile. And that's kind of going to the second bullet point here. They don't overlap as much in kind of their native ranges, going to that geographical distinction. And if you do end up producing hybrids, you're going to start seeing some real problems in their fertility, not just in reproducing themselves, but even in going and taking that hybrid and trying to connect it to another plant. On the other hand, we look at orchids and they look very distinctly different. So we have Epidendrum canopium here at the top, Brassivola nodosa down below, and these are geographically distinct. They have a little bit of overlap in range, but you can cross these and you might not have 100% fertility, but you'll still be producing hundreds, if not thousands, of individuals from it. And so this is something that's just going to keep coming up, is if we kind of suspend our normal way of thinking about a species and recognize that orchids just don't play by those rules, it really kind of lets the mind run wild with all this diversity. So I sort of mentioned this in the previous slide. I talked about hybrids between different species. So interspecific is the term you'll hear thrown around a lot for that in the literature. Orchids also do something which is pretty rare in the plant world called intergeneric, or crosses between different genera. And kind of this has been documented in other plants, but orchids take it to another level. So different sections within a subtribe, and even within different subtribes of the same subfamily or tribe. So this is kind of the furthest, most far out example I could find. So we have Certicilum macranthum, which is an oncidium type orchid, and some folks in South America at Equigenera were able to make a hybrid with Maxillaria sanderiana. And so these are in the same tribe, but everything taxonomically below that is different. And yet these are able to produce a hybrid. Now, I haven't seen yet whether this hybrid is fertile or not, and that'll be kind of the true carbon test, but it's a plant, it's able to grow and flower. Orchids really kind of push the boundaries of what we think of in terms of species and other kind of taxonomic barriers. So I'm going to go a little bit into nomenclature because if you have had a background in botany, you're probably going to see some terms being used a little bit differently. And I want to make sure we're pretty much on the same page. So orchids have what are called crexes. And that's when you make a cross between two species or two hybrids or a hybrid in species, it's always going to have the same name. And so in this example, if we cross Dendrobium victoria reginae, which is native to the Philippines. And in fact, every time you see a bolded name here, that's a species that's native to the Philippines. I tried to go through, might have missed a few. If I did, let me know in the chat. But if you cross that with Dendrobium cruinatum, also native to the Philippines, you end up with a grex known as Dendrobium Keach tan. And so they're both dendrobiums, so it has the same genus, but then you have this grex that you've registered, and there's an official way of doing this through the Royal Horticultural Society, and you get to choose whatever name you want when you're the first one who makes a given grex. In this case, the breeder who made this, Lau Moiwa, at Gardens by the Bay, decided to name it after his boss, and my boss also at the time, Keach Tan, who was the CEO of Gardens by the Bay. And this, I think it doesn't always get brought up. You'll hear stories occasionally about scientists who really want a species named after them, or sometimes, even excitingly, a genus. Orchids, you get a lot more opportunities. It's relatively rare you're going to find a new species, but if you have the resources to pollinate an orchid and grow up the seedlings, you can have a grex and name it after someone. And indeed, I didn't showcase all of them here, but Dr. Tan has at least 7 different orchids named after him. I think there's one more on the next slide. One of the things that really allows orchids to produce these unusual combinations is the fact that there's all these seeds that I mentioned. They're very small, but high numbers. So you're getting between 1 million, or I've seen documented as high as 4 million. I've heard rumors of even more, but that's in one seed pod, and you can have multiple seed pods per plant. Now, that's not to say, every pollination you make is going to produce a seed pod, but even if something has a 1 in a million chance, and this hybrid is not, between 2 very closely related species, this was a relatively risky one to try to make, there's that chance that you can get it because you're playing the numbers game that way. And so orchids have really kind of grown up around this grex system, and growers and breeders really rely on it. And I think I have an example in another few slides of how we kind of trace that and use it as we're kind of keeping track of different combinations. Just to kind of drive home, I know for myself, I really enjoy visual examples. You'll see lots of pictures in my slides. This is an example of the same grex with different forms of the different parent species. So on the left, we have 3 different forms of Phalaenopsis cornicervi. In the middle, we have Phalaenopsis violacea. And on the right, we have the hybrid between them, or the grex called Phalaenopsis valentinii. Now, any combination of these with the left and middle columns is going to produce something on the right known as valentinii, even though the parents look very different. It might be different forms, horticultural or kind of true varieties of the species, but all these ones along here on the right are going to be Phalaenopsis valentinii. And to add another layer of complexity, I decided I wanted to cross this one with this one and make a hybrid. Because they're both valentinii, that'll still be valentinii. And so you can sit there and kind of keep capitulating that. And it really kind of makes the mind boggle a little bit if you think of, okay, there's already this much diversity in both of the parents, I can combine them. And then when I combine within the offspring, I can get combinations that neither of the parents have seen, but that still has that same name. So kind of getting into that, it gets even more complex as we add in lots of species and lots of genera. So orchids at this point have, been hybridized since the mid 1800s, and I'll touch on that in a few slides. But because of that, it can be really complicated to go back and see, all right, 20 generations ago, what were the original species involved in this hybrid? If we kept breeding a hybrid with a hybrid and not with species, what's in the background? So there are now lots of databases. This is a free one I use called Orchid Roots that shows the percent in the pedigree of different species. You can see something can be really low, like a Cattleya mendelii here, where it's 0.78% of that pedigree is around. In terms of actual genetics and DNA, there's probably almost nothing that you could tell in this plant that comes from that Cattleya. But because we're relying on this naming and Grex system, we still kind of give a nod to its ancestors that way. And then you can see ones that are kind of much higher percents, Cattleya walkeriana, Cattleya purpurata, and then getting into other genera such as Brassavola and Nodosa. And that's where you start getting these names that also start changing in addition to kind of the secondary part of the orchid name or the Grex name. So I'm hoping that gives you a little bit of a idea as we kind of go through. So kind of going in depth a little bit more onto the Grex, if we're combining different genera, like I just showed on the slide before, there's a few conventions in how we make up the names. So starting out, if we have two genera, we typically try to combine them. And the person who creates that first combination gets to choose which portions they want. So on the top here, we have like Guarianthe, which is one genus, crossed with Rhyncholalia. And then the combination of those, they're calling Rhynchanthe. Okay, so that's two genera. If we take that same combination and then add in a Cattleya, so now we have three genera, we have Rhyncattleanthe. And it's, you can see again, kind of little bits of each of them, Rhyn from Rhyncholalia, Cat from Cattleya, Ianthe from Guarianthe. But then, okay, we've got three, now we add one more. At that point, this is very far removed from anything you're going to see in the wild. And the orchid registrars let you come up with a new genus in addition to that Grex name that I mentioned before. So in this case, we see if we add to this hybrid above the genus Brassavola, you end up with something that looks like this and is Kahuzakara. And I had to look it up. Cahuzac is apparently a common French last name. So my apologies to anyone that I'm mispronouncing it for. But so this person then got to name the whole genus, but then also this Grex. And to kind of give it a more concrete example, if we add in another genus, we get to create yet another genus name. In this case, Kiatanara. So here, showing again my old boss, Kiatan. And in this case, he's going to get any combination of these genera all together is going to end up with Kiatanara at the beginning as the genus, and then after that, with the Grex name after that. And so in this case, it's honoring him, but it's also honoring a dignitary who came and visited him, Sir Sarkisian. And so it's a chance to really kind of, for one thing, honor different people and, kind of be a little bit famous. Lots of folks might not get a chance to meet Kiat, but they can grow up an orchid with his name. And this, you'll see lots of cases with this, with orchids that are really, their fame has outlasted even the lifetime of the person they were named after. So the example I like to bring up with this is, if you really get into it, you can have a lot of fun with it. There was a breeder in the 1980s, Jim Rumrill, who started combining genera, and he did get into some where he had kind of multiple genera together and got to kind of create his own name that way. And there is, I believe, a Rumrillara. But even for ones that were shorter, he liked playing around with other Latin or Greek names. So if he combined epidendrum with amblostoma, and he could have said amblodendrum or something like that, but instead he said epistoma, which is another scientific name. At first, like, people were a little upset about that. They're like, oh, are they going to be thinking of the epistoma like a body part? But no, he could get away with it because it was a combination of the two. Same thing, he combined Scaphoglottis couragera with Epidendrum radicans and named it epiglottis as the genus, and then Rumrill elf. And epiglottis is, I had to look this up, a part of your throat. And so again, if you go and Google epiglottis, you're going to end up with much more stuff about the body part. But it was his way of kind of poking fun at scientific naming. And kind of the most outrageous example I can think of is Jim Rumrill is a big baseball fan. And so he made a hybrid between Comparitia falcata and Gomisa crespa. So again, two different genera, two different species, and decided that year there was a big baseball game that was being played by the New York Mets. And so he wanted to say, go Mets. And so he argued, okay, using Go Meta and Comparitia, he could do Go Media and then Pennant, named after the pennant that they were playing in that year. So it's really a kind of chance to not only sit there and see what these combinations of different species look like, but also play around with different names. And you'll see some names, I believe, later that also honor people who have passed, where they'll put a memoria and then someone's name. Like there's a Memoria Princess Diana, for example. And so that way you're kind of getting to honor someone even if you couldn't give them that orchid in life. One of the things that really fires my imagination, though, is with orchids, the combinations are literally infinite. And I'll have people kind of raise their eyebrows at me when I say that and kind of question it. They're like, no, there has to be one point at which this stops. No, you can keep combining it. So we start over here on the right if we're looking at this family tree. We take Dendrobium canaliculatum, this kind of star-shaped, brightly colored orchid, and cross it with Dendrobium bigibbum. You end up with this hybrid Dendrobium mini pearl. Then a breeder decided, okay, what if I take that and cross it back to that parent Dendrobium bigibbum? All right, you end up with something named Cherry Dance. It looks a little bit more like bigibbum. But what if I took that and combined that with bigibbum again? Well, you see, you're ending up with something that looks more and more like bigibbum, but that still has different coloration. So one decided to do that yet again and do that yet again. So you end up eventually with this hybrid Dendrobium pearl vera that's 97% Dendrobium bigibbum. And to the naked eye looks a lot like Dendrobium bigibbum, but has its own Grex name and honors the person like Pearl vera. And this is something that'll also come up a little bit when I get into some of the controversy and drama in the orchid world that I think is fun. When I say infinite, you could sit there and then take Pearl vera, and if you wanted, cross that back to Dendrobium bigibbum again. Or you could cross that again to Dendrobium canaliculatum and see if it ends up looking like mini pearl or something else, or any number of other dendrobiums. Really, the sky ends up being the limit. It's almost, with a lot of other crops, you hear people complain about, oh, there's not enough diversity. With orchids, it's almost the opposite. You have so much diversity, you have to kind of rein yourself in. So just a quick slide on the process of this, to show what it looks like logistically, because this ends up being where the real rate limiting step is for orchids. So I mentioned orchid seeds are small and, kind of dust grain size. Look at them under a microscope. These are unfortunately unhealthy looking seeds. I was looking for my healthy seeds slide, and I could only find this one where they're faded, but they're barely visible to the naked eye. And if you go and spread these on, super sterilize them and then put them on a nutrient media, like a petri dish, that sort of thing, a lot of them will germinate. And so in the wild, they rely on kind of spreading everywhere, and they rely on relationships with symbiotic fungi to germinate. If we give them all the nutrients, we're going to end up getting a lot of germination, whereas in the wild, they might only have 2 or 3 out of those million that make it. So here you can see each one of these little green dots is its own plant and its own hybrid that's growing up. Later, what most orchid breeders do is they go through and pick out the best looking ones, the ones that are the largest, the happiest, the healthiest, move that to new nutrient medium, and then do that again. And these are what are called flasks. And you'll see kind of fancier looking ones. In this case, this was in Thailand where they were taking soda bottles and liquor bottles and putting them in there. One nice thing about flasks is they don't have any outside contamination. And so this has really allowed orchids to travel all over the world uh, by bypassing a lot of the inspections that plants that you would be, say, carrying seeds of, or even a piece of a plant of, are going to be limited. In this case, they can see there's no contaminating fungi or bacteria because they would have taken over the media, right? And so it's just the orchid there. And so with this, it's really allowed free distribution of orchids around the world. And once you have a flask like this, you would pull it out, and then you have a small plantlet, and then you'd start growing that up. And at that point, it's kind of like growing any other sort of orchid or plant. But I kind of wanted to show you the side that doesn't always get made. And when, again, getting that visualization of those million seeds and what that can look like in terms of creating some of these combinations. So early on, orchid growers and breeders kind of realized they could do this. And it was sort of interesting in that a lot of them didn't recognize some of the species or genera that we think of today, and so didn't necessarily limit themselves. And I think this really helped in kind of creating some of these original hybrids. I did look up the earliest orchid hybrid was registered in, I believe it was 1865. So these aren't quite that early, but these are ones I selected because they're still being grown today. Kind of going back to that Greg's model of naming that I mentioned, might not be the original plant, but someone decided, okay, I have Cattleya mossii, I have Cattleya purpurata. I'm going to make a hybrid between those, and using the Greg system, that's still going to have the name Cattleya canhamiana. So even though it was probably bred after 1885, it's still going to keep that same name. And it's a really cool connection to the past that way. A lot of these hybrids are what we call primary hybrids, where it's a hybrid between two species. But they learned pretty quickly that you could keep the kind of momentum going and breed hybrids back to species, or even hybrids with other hybrids. In this case, I'm looking at Phragmipedium giganteum, which is a hybrid between a species, Caudatum, and then Grande, which is a hybrid. One good sort of rule of thumb is you're looking at names, the whole thing's italicized, it's a species. The second part is capitalized and non-italicized, that's a hybrid. One thing that I will say about these early hybrids, and this is where the naming convention has kind of changed a little bit, is you can see a lot of these sound like species names. Giganteum sounds a lot like Caudatum, right? Canhamiana is like purpurata or other things like that, where they have these kind of Latin or Greek endings. This has later phased out because there was a lot of confusion. People were selling this and people would say, oh, it's a species, Cattleya canhamiana. No, the registrar said all new orchid names have to be something that's distinguishable as a hybrid instead. So then you started to kind of see hybridizing really explode. And I'm going to give a few examples here and go a little bit in depth into some of the breeding, and then if there's some controversy, I'll touch on that, or if there's been some research. So the first one I'm going to touch on is going to be dendrobiums. These are native throughout Southeast Asia, the Pacific Islands, including the Philippines, and Australia. I showed Dendrobium bagivum in that example before with sort of the infinite combinations. So this is kind of, I think, what a lot of us think of if we are familiar with Dendrobium orchids. But this has kind of this nice pinkish fuchsia color. And it's in a section within the genus Dendrobium Phalananthe. And you'll see these abbreviations for genomes. That'll come up in the next slide. So I'm just putting it in here to kind of get your feet wet with it. You can combine this species with other species in the genus and produce something that looks kind of intermediate. Or you can take a species that's in a different section within the genus and breed it with other ones in that genus and kind of try to improve them. So Dendrobium helix is in section spatulata. These are the so-called antelope types where they have these kind of twisty petals. And you can breed that with, say, Mirbellianum, and you end up with something that's darker but still has those twists. Likewise, Dendrobium polysema, it's in section Lautoria of the genus Dendrobium. You could breed this with some other ones within the genus Dendrobium, and it's going to look more or less like this. This is Dendrobium royal chip that's only has species from the section Lautoria of the genus Dendrobium in its background. But if you go and combine something like this with something from the section Phalananthe, you'll end up with something that looks a little intermediate. These are, I realize there's a lot kind of going on here, and these are, not the exact what the exact combinations look like, but just to kind of show you when you take something round and purple like this, cross it with something antelope like that, you're going to end up with something like this. Likewise, you cross it with something really funky and green, you're going to end up with something where the color kind of comes through from the bigibbum, but the shape ends up starting to reflect some of that Lautoria background. And so Dr. Haruyuki Kawamoto started kind of noticing this, and he first noticed it in plants that were shown to him by a local grower, but then he started thinking of this from a chromosome point of view and started thinking, okay, well, we can make these hybrids between these different types of dendrobiums, but the fertility might not be as good, or, they're going to start segregating out in the next generation. And what he really wanted was orchids that could be produced from seed so that they would, orchids don't necessarily transmit their viruses via seed. So if you had one that you could grow from seed, get, again, those sort of millions of plants, it could be, for one thing, a way to clean out viruses that tend to accumulate in the plants, but then also a way to potentially have something that is going to be kind of pure breeding. And so what he did was he would make the hybrid like this, Dendrobium bigibbum, Dendrobium gouldii, and he would double the chromosomes. And so if you look, I think the best way to think about it is these letters afterwards. So section Phalananthe, section spatulata. He takes it, the hybrid would be 1P and 1S. If we think about a chromosome level, the P's and the S are sort of going to be able to combine with each other, but not really well. By doubling it, he gave that P a copy of itself that those chromosomes can pair with, because they're going to be from that same section. And same with the S. And so we ended up with Jacqueline Thomas, and this is a tetraploid form. Because of this is, for one thing, going to have better fertility because of that pairing, but also it's going to be a way that it's going to be not 100% true breeding, but pretty close to true breeding, because you're having this doubling of that original line. You're not getting the recombination that normally goes on. This was done between section Phalananthe and section spatulata, but he kind of went wild and did it with a bunch of others. You combine bigibbum with macrophyllum, which is from that Lautoria section I mentioned on the slide before. You end up with something called macrobig. And he did the same sort of process where he doubled the chromosomes, and so he could have just kept going with macrobig and done that with seed production. But he wanted to see if we combine this with a really funky looking one in section Lautoria, Dendrobium spectabile, what would that result look like? And he ended up with a dendrobium called Dendrobium pua'ala. And Dr. Kawamoto was great in that he named most of his plants after people he worked with, people, who had supported him. Pua'ala then has 1P and 1L from the macrobig parent and 1L from the spectabile parent. So because of that, the shape ends up kind of being influenced heavily from these Lautoria types, but the color is still from the bigibbum. Unfortunately, 3 sets of chromosomes typically end up with some degree of sterility. This is actually how we get seedless watermelons. And so this isn't always one that you can breed with. But again, you could try making a hybrid with this and get that 1 in a million chance, and that's all you'd need to get that one hybrid. And maybe if you crossed it with something that had another Phalananthe, you could end up with something that could pair with that P. So this is something that really kind of revolutionized the cut flower trait in Hawaii, was being able to produce hybrids from seed instead of having to just wait for the plant to grow large enough that you could divide it. I saw Dr. Amore on here, and I didn't realize she was going to be joining. So thank you for joining, Dr. Amore. But this is actually what got me into orchids, was all these kind of possibilities and what you could do with them. And so when I did my first internship with her back in 2004, I documented some of the hybrids she had going around. And it let me kind of look not only in sort of what general combinations look like. So again, sort of a Phalananthe type with a spatulata type that ends up kind of in that in-between sort of shape, but also when you start getting into more complex traits. So here we have two more complex dendrobiums, the bush pansy and Theodore Takaguchi, that have that poloria I was talking about. And because of the name pansy and sort of the slight resemblance to it, folks started calling this the pansy lip trait. And so there'd been some discussion, is this a recessive? Is this dominant? And you can see some of the offspring that ended up having kind of this pansy lip trait just like that. But you also start to see some that look intermediate. And same thing, once you start breeding with others, like in this case, Dendrobium caesar, crossing this to Ethel Kamamoto, named after Dr. Kamamoto's wife, you get all sorts of different variation. You get ones that look a lot like Caesar, that have that kind of classic shape. Once in a while, you end up with some that have a little bit something funky going on with the lip. And so, I really love just kind of seeing how these unique traits segregate in this already diverse population. So thank you again to Dr. Omori for really educating me and also for letting me take all these pictures back in the day. Getting into cattleyas, I could go on about so many different types of orchids, so I tried to constrain myself. But cattleya are ones that I think we still see as ones that represent orchids to a lot of people. These are from Central and South America, so you're not going to, unfortunately, see species native to the Philippines. But for a long time, these were the corsage orchids. These are still the ones that whenever I see an orchid in kind of popular culture, it's almost always this. Like, I think there was a James Bond poisonous orchid that was modeled after a cattleya. A lot of the early hybrid, a lot of the popular ones for corsages were these kind of large white ones. But you also see, and this is kind of interesting and different from some of the other breeding groups that we look at, where they're trying to get a species that's difficult to grow and something that looks like that, but is easier to kind of grow and flower. And so instead of kind of trying to get these new combinations of colors, they really want something that looks like, say, Cattleya coccinea or Cattleya dowiana, but both of these are really difficult to grow species. And so the idea with breeding with them then is, for one thing, to see what the combinations look like, but then also to start combining with other traits that make them easier to grow. And what we see is once we start moving away from things that are pure dowiana or pure coccinea, you can still end up with something that looks a lot like that, and but only has a little bit of the species in the background and is easier to flower. So Cattleya red doll, for instance, is 75% Cattleya coccinea, as a parent and a grandparent. But that other 25%, that Lele cinnabarina, means that this cool growing, high mountain species, can instead, this hybrid from it can flower at the equator in Singapore because of those other genetics. Likewise, Branchilalia Cattleya toshiayoki, you end up with something that only has about 58% Cattleya dowiana in its pedigree, but that looks a lot like it, and some would even say, slightly better shape, but that has a lot easier ways to grow because of this kind of mixed ancestry. I wanted to also include, I think we think cattleyas, we think these big and frilly things, but there are other cattleya species out there that are used a lot in breeding that look really different, and that might even be in the background of this, not contributing necessarily to that color or shape, but perhaps contributing to that ability to grow. Since we're talking about biodiversity, though, and talking about breeding, one of the things that we start coming up against is, okay, what's a true species? And this was a controversy that happened a few years ago, as you can see from the publication. So folks were using Cattleya walkeriana, and they wanted to use it in breeding because it's a smaller plant, it's really fragrant. But the alba form, the form without pigment, was one that didn't have as nice a shape. And then suddenly, folks started seeing on the market Cattleya walkeriana alba pendentive. This was a tetraploided, double the number of chromosomes. Everyone was kind of blown away that looking at this versus that, wow, it looks a lot, fuller, the petals are thicker, and the fragrance was really nice. But people started saying, no, that looks way too different. That can't be true walkeriana. And so a group in Japan decided, okay, well, let's see, how closely related are all these other Cattleya walkerianas, and maybe we can test it with some closely related species and see if it overlaps. So they ended up doing molecular genetic tests on it and looking at the DNA. And when they ran the DNA through kind of algorithms to end up with these combination these phylogenetic trees, they saw, okay, it's in the same cluster as Cattleya walkeriana alba. So, the suggestion is it really is a true Cattleya walkeriana. And the reason they could sort of tell that is Cattleya nobilior is closely related, but looks different enough. And so they thought, okay, if it was something close to walkeriana, but maybe not, it would probably start to cluster further out like nobilior. Or even Cattleya lodogezii, which looks very different and has a very different growth habit, but that there are natural hybrids occurring with. So they started to see, okay, it's not clustering with the lodogezii, it's not clustering with the nobilior. We're pretty sure in this case that it's a true walkeriana. And we're able to then use it in breeding and also talk about it as a species and some of the characteristics. Sort of along those lines, there's been some discussion. I mentioned kind of that example earlier of taking a hybrid and crossing it back where it ends up looking like the one species. In that case, I was talking about Dendrobium. Well, I was at the World Orchid Conference in Ecuador in 2017. And there were some folks who were saying, in the last few years, we've started to see pylorics in a wide range of species. There'd been a pyloric form of Cattleya intermedia called Forma quinii, but they said, we're starting to see it in Cattleya walkeriana, Cattleya leopoldii, and Cattleya harrisoniana. And people are willing to kind of pay a premium because these are the pure species, but with this kind of unusual trait. Well, someone at the conference said they had pretty good evidence that instead of these being true species, someone had done kind of like what I showed with the Dendrobium pearl-vera and taken an intermedia, crossed it with walkeriana, and then kept crossing that hybrid and the offspring back to walkeriana to get something that looks like walkeriana, but that has that same sort of pyloric characteristic where the petals have some of that lip. And what they claimed was that a lot of these other species, it's the same thing. And people were doing it because people said, it's a rare form and they could get a premium price on it. But if we were to look at the genetics, that wouldn't hold out. As far as I know, no one's actually done the molecular genetic work on this yet to kind of test it out. But I think, as we talk about biodiversity and, remembering species are a human construct, there are folks who kind of use that construct to their advantage. And so keeping that in mind. I'll move on at this point to breeding vandas. Vandas are nice in that they, for one thing, are native to the Philippines. So I can share one of the few that I know of that has a common name, Vanda sanderiana, or the Waling Waling orchid. But a lot of the breeding with them, at least in the early days, was trying to get kind of this flat shape of Vanda sanderiana and the color of Vanda cerulea. And Vanda cerulea is kind of a high mist forest orchid, but with this incredible color. So very difficult to grow for people in warmer areas, but they wanted that color. And so trying to combine either cerulea or sanderiana. But then they also started seeing, well, we could combine other kind of related genera, like I was talking about with Cattleya, and bring in other traits for them. So you started seeing folks breeding with what at the time was a different genus, Vanda, but previously Ascocentrum miniata, where you get all these kind of flowers on one spike, and you end up with this bright kind of orangish color. The flowers are a lot smaller, but it produces them more often. They also started breeding with things like Papilionanthe. And this is a genus that has kind of really fine, almost like pine needle type leaves that can tolerate high temperatures, and ending up with kind of hybrids that look a lot like a Vanda, but that have some of the heat tolerance of Papilionanthe. There were other combinations bringing in bright red colors from Renanthera. Renanthera, this is a hybrid, but both of the parents, Philippinensis and Storii, are native to the Philippines. People love the red colors. There's these huge sprays, but unfortunately the flowers are not very long-lived. So the idea was, can we breed this with something that has longer-lived flowers or wider, flatter flowers, but that bright kind of color? Other genera like Rhynchostylus, breeding them for the fragrance, and then even Phalaenopsis. And I'm not going to talk too much about Phalaenopsis today, But I think a lot of the times when we see Phalaenopsis orchids in kind of a grocery store or in a market, we kind of think of them as being a force unto themselves, but they're closely related enough to Vandas that you can even get hybrids between Phalaenopsis and Vanda with some of the best characteristics of each. So of course, folks started making these hybrids, started noticing patterns. And one of the ones that I like to bring up as an example is Vanda falcata, and this is known as the samurai orchid. It's native to Japan, as the name would assume, and it's really, really dominant in terms of its traits. It has these star-shaped flowers that happen to be really fragrant, but if you cross it with other species, you don't end up with something intermediate like you'd expect. You end up with something that looks a lot like Vanda falcata. So crossing it with Walling Walling, you end up with something like this. Crossing it with Arides lawrencei, which is a kind of small cupped orchid, you get a little bit of that color, but otherwise you end up with something, again, that looks like falcata. And even crossing it with something like Papilionanthe terres, you end up with basically a larger falcata. And so folks have been trying for years to kind of figure out how to breed with this, how to use this kind of diversity, get that small plant size, get this fragrance, but get something that has more attractive flowers. Well, while breeders were looking at that, there were other folks who were taking it the opposite direction. Vanda falcata in its native range is pretty much only white. There are some variations in it. There's this form that you can see has some color on the flower, but it's not on the flower itself. It's mostly on the peduncle and a little bit on the spur. Likewise, there's been, at least a few that are documented as having green flowers instead of white. And folks thought, okay, well, if there's this variation, there might be more. And you started seeing some Vandas that hit the market that looked like this. And the color was really dark, and even kind of the serious collectors in Japan paying many thousands of dollars for a plant said, yeah, I'm pretty sure that's a falcata. There's pretty good evidence now that instead of it being a true falcata, some unscrupulous breeder had done kind of like I mentioned with the phyloric cattleyas, and taken falcata, bred it with probably Vanda ampullaceae, which has these bright colors, and then crossed it back to Vanda falcata a few times and tried to pass it off as the real deal. Same thing, there was an orange form of falcata that was hitting the market. People wanted, something that was new and different, right? Like we all love kind of that something that's unusual. And they were really excited, but it turns out this again is probably a hybrid with Vanda miniata that then got crossed back to Vanda falcata. And so you get that kind of falcata shape, falcata growth habit, but just enough of the genes to keep the colors from these two other Vanda species. And so, kind of passing something off as naturally occurring diversity when in fact this is man-made diversity. I know I'm getting pretty close to time here, so I'll try to wrap it up. But one thing that I've also seen within Vandas is you start seeing also cut flowers where there was, how can we keep something that looks really good like this, but make the flower last longer? And there were a lot of genera that were kind of looked at. And one of the ones that seemed to do really well was Arachnis, or the scorpion orchids. These are orchids that the flowers last 2 to 3 times as long as a Vanda, but they tend to have that kind of spider shape. And while I think that's cool, lots of consumers wanted something that looks more kind of round, more brightly colored. What people found, kind of like with the dendrobium combinations, is that you could get something that had both that Vanda genome and an Arachnis genome. You end up with something that looks a little star-shaped, but you have the color from the Vanda that makes it really spectacular. And so these ended up kind of hitting the market and taking them by storm, were known as mocaras. This is, in that case, kind of using these different genera to sort of supplement Vanda. People already think this is pretty good to perfect, but how can we improve it while still having it be something recognizable? And so that was kind of the idea behind it. I didn't have space or time to kind of show it, but there's been further work beyond this, where just kind of like the dendrobium example, they'll cross it back to a Vanda. And so you have something that has 2 complements of the Vanda genome, one of the Arachnis. So it looks a lot like a Vanda, but the flowers last longer because of the arachnis background. With that, think this is my second to last slide. I know we're right up there against the end. Just some thoughts on harnessing diversity in orchids for other ways. We're starting to see more and more kind of really unusual combinations, multiple genera. I think this one has at least 10 different genera in its background. But also trying to bring in, these diverse genera into something that's easy to grow. So an encyclia in this case, or Phalaenopsis in this case. These are great, I think, for the common grower, where we can take difficult species, make them growable for a wide range of environments. But I also think this has some great applications for conservation. So one example I think of is Epidendrum elensi. This is a species where it's only been found in nature once. The story goes that it was found on trees that had already been cut down, and as those trees were being taken away by a logging company. And so there's a really narrow genetic base. Now, ethically, I realize there's some issues, but this could be something where maybe we cross this with something that has a wider genetic base and then cross it back to Elensi and do that a few times. This has been debated in different conservation groups, kind of leave it up to discussion, but just something I think can kind of be thought about as we're working with some of these really rare and endangered species. With that, salamat po for your attention. These are some of the references I used and also just some things that I think are great to read. If we have time, I'd be happy to answer any questions. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Dr. Keach, for your colorful and, well, pardon the pun, flowery presentation. I know a lot of those here in the webinar have, interesting questions for you. And so without any further delay, I would like to introduce our guest open forum moderator, Professor Annalie S. Hadsal. Professor Hadsal is a faculty member of the Plant Biology Division of the Institute of Biological Sciences here at UPLB, and she is also the Museum of Natural History's curator for orchids and epiphytes. Annalie?
Yes, good morning. That was very informative, Dr. Keach. Yeah, he gave us basic morphology of how to identify an orchid. When you're out there in the field, that's one thing that you have to look. Of course, in the flower will be the lip or the labellum. And then he walked us through the nomenclature part, which is very interesting, but I'm going to ask the question later on. So the first question is from Anna Levina. Okay, what are the next breeding goals in orchid breeding? That's the first question.
Ooh, I could give a whole presentation just about that, so I'll try to keep it short. Orchids, I think, like flowers in general, we refer to it as a fashion industry, right? Different goals change with time. One thing I've seen is folks trying to breed for climate change, where, orchids that can withstand a wider range of conditions. Folks are, before orchids were something that were kind of mostly viewed as like an upper class sort of plant. Now they've kind of gotten into the hands of a wider range of people across the world. So it's how can we keep these plants going that are adapted, something that you can grow easily in your office, say. There's also been some work with new colors, some true blues that are out there. Us orchid people tend to call purple cerulean and say that's blue, but there's some that look like actually like sky blue. And I think that's kind of in some ways, the real like end goal. But yeah, oh gosh, get me started on this and I'll keep going all day. So I think I'll leave it at that. Thanks, Anna.
Okay. Second question, still from Anna Levina, would be, how can we make sure that the biodiversity remains and that monoculture will not dominate?
Ooh, that's a really important question. I think one thing I've noticed that gives me some hope for that is kind of like clothing fashion, everyone has sort of different tastes. And so, I've been pleasantly surprised that like if we look at a Cattleya orchid, I showed kind of those big white, round corsage types. That's kind of what I was raised thinking is good. but I know at least one breeder who likes really star-shaped flowers. You want something thin petals, thin sepals. And so instead it's been using completely different species and completely different combinations. Some folks have kind of signed on with him, some haven't, but we've seen, as kind of trends come and go, orchids have kind of picked up some of these and really adopted them. I think one of the bigger issues is going to be conservation of the species that form the background of a lot of these hybrids. And that I think I'd love to see some work of, people who are breeding orchids that are from an area, giving back to that area and helping with conservation work in that area. I know this model has been used by other breeders who've used plants from different locations. I'd love to see orchids kind of take that on, but that's going to be a big fight, I suspect.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Keach. Another question from a UPLB student. Have breeding hybrids become a way to preserve rare orchid species, especially those vulnerable to climate change? And if there's an example, can you give us?
I can't, offhand, I'm trying to think of an example of a hybrid. The example, and I almost put this in the talk, I wish I had, there was an example once of Paphiopedilum delenatii. This is a lady slipper that's native to Vietnam. And when it was first discovered, I believe back in the 1800s, 2 plants were discovered, and that was it. They were brought back to Europe. One of the plants died when in the hands of the botanical garden there, and the other was grown by a commercial organization. It was considered very difficult to grow, very difficult to flower. However, it was able to be self-pollinated. And in the intervening century, through generations of plants that have been descended from this one plant, breeders have selected plants of Paphiopedilum delenatii that are easy to grow, easy to flower, tolerate a really wide range of conditions. And that was working again with just the diversity that was present in that one plant. It was later rediscovered in the wild, I think, I want to say in the 90s. And there is quite a, you look at it and they look very different, the ones that have been bred by humans versus the ones that are kind of occurring in the wild. But you can definitely kind of use some of that diversity and bring that in. For hybrids, I could certainly see, there are a few where the species is, if not extinct in the wild, pretty close to it. And the Epidendrum elensi might be one of those where we're not seeing too much of it anymore.
Okay, thank you. Very informative. Now you were introducing a lot of these interspecific and intergeneric hybridization. So one question here from Dr. Hilario is, how common does hybridization occur in the wild?
It does occur actually relatively often. If the geographic range overlaps between 2 species, even if they look relatively different, you can end up with naturally occurring hybrids. Some of these have been collected and, again, species being somewhat of a human construct, it can be hard to tell if something is, truly a hybrid or a hybrid back cross to a few species, but there's some really beautiful examples. They also form what are called hybrid swarms, where it kind of crosses back to one parent, then to the other in different combinations. Some orchids seem really to do this often, others not so much. Like Cattleyas, it's pretty common. There's a handful of Dendrobiums I know, but maybe not as much with like Phragmipediums.
Okay, thank you. And another question from a student here, an undergraduate student. Should like to ask the most important factors to consider before breeding orchids.
Ooh, I think one thing to think about is, what do you like the most? Orchids, and I didn't say this, I always kind of added at the end because I want to get folks hooked on orchids first. But orchids take a long time to mature. Fast maturing orchid will go from seed to flower in about 2 years. Others, if we're looking at something like a Vanda, it might be 8 years. Cattleya could even be 10 years, depending on the species in the background. And so the advice I got going into grad school is the same sort of advice I'll give about breeding orchids, which is make sure you really like the orchids you're working with. That being said, I think there's also thinking about, are you doing this as a hobby that you're going to kind of finance yourself, or are you doing this as a business? If you're doing this as a hobby, you can pick kind of your aesthetic and work with ones that are really difficult. If you're doing this as a business, you want something that's going to grow easily and flower easily. I've also seen some breeders who work with flowers that are not as exciting looking, but that mature faster. So there were a few Cattleya relatives that mature, say, in 2 to 3 years instead of maybe 5 to 10, and kind of combining those into the background. And like any sort of good plant project, also looking at what your growing conditions are and how much you can change those in terms of pests, diseases, other characteristics. You might live in a really dry and hot area. You're probably not going to be able to easily grow something from cool, sort of misty forests. But if you're willing to give it that time, maybe you can, and then you can breed it with something that grows easier. So just kind of having a realistic view of what your limitations and your strengths are.
Okay, thank you. I see that you are a member of the American Orchid Society. In the Philippines, in the early 80s, we do have this Philippine Orchid Society. And I think one of the members of this society is Dr. Helen Valmayor. She's known to be the first, probably the first, when I was a student then, first orchid breeder in the Philippines. We have an annual, you have an annual activity in the campus in UPLB, where we have the so-called garden show. We have the garden shows, and usually during garden shows, that's where you have a lot of these orchid hybrids, actually, from different nurseries, from different proper plant breeders. Okay, and what we usually see would be the waling-waling, the Vanda sanderiana. Yeah, so very common when you have this annual orchid show or garden shows. We have for the past years, we always have orchids, mga commercial or hybrid orchids. Because later on, aside from orchid hybrids, garden shows now would be, a lot of them would be focusing on Hoya. And I'm sure you know this Hoya. And for a short time, you also have this Doña Aurora varieties, this Musaenda, probably Musaenda. And of course, the one I'm seeing on your background, you have a lot of that, that's hibiscus, right? What you have there would be hibiscus on your background. And I think the other one would be some sort of gingers, okay?
Yeah.
Or the other one would be, what would be a heliconia? Looks like a lobster claw, okay?
Yeah, heliconia,
Yeah,
and I
okay.
think some plumeria maybe.
Oh yeah, plumeria, yeah, very nice, yes. So my question is, when you talk of orchid industry, and commercial orchid industry, it really costs a fortune. It's a booming industry. So my question would be, how do you think the commercial orchid industry would better support efforts towards species conservation?
One thing I think with that is it's to everyone's benefit, to have diversity within a species, as well as, these kind of hybrids. And I think sometimes educating these commercial folks that, hey, if you're interested in the variation within the species and you want these rare forms, like something that's an alba or a different color, it's worth kind of conserving them. And maybe then I've seen some work in terms of trying to replant species in the wild. The challenge with that is I think pollinators are attracted to different things than humans are when we select different plants within a species. And so I would say, maybe instead of using the diversity that we kind of view visually, looking at, say, a molecular genetic view of different orchids in existence. A lot of, unfortunately, historical orchid collection was done really unethically, ripping plants off trees, in large numbers, not necessarily noting where they are. And so maybe looking and seeing if we compare the ones of this species from different collections, do they have the diversity that we're seeing from the wild? Are there bits that kind of aren't captured there? And if so, could we start breeding those back to some of the wild forms? And since it's a fashion-driven industry, maybe push the aesthetic that way as well. You know, there's nothing to say that it has to stay big, flat, and round, I think, which is, you know, a lot of folks talk about with an ideal orchid, you know, that they instead could be looking for something that looks a lot more in nature and, you know, drive the industry that way.
Thank you. It's another question here from Richard Angelo Sioson. Good day, Dr. Keach. In cases of species or grex like Phalaenopsis valentini that occurs in different variation in appearance, how can you simply identify one without actually testing its molecular components?
Ooh, that is the million-dollar question there. You'll see people who have an incredible knowledge of certain hybrids and can pick them out visually. I am not one of those people. I wish I was. But it really becomes being familiar with the different parent species. And as I mentioned, you know, when you start crossing, say, a Valentinii with another Valentinii, it's possible that it's going to come out looking a lot like more like one of the parents than the others. That being said, I start to see, you know, folks who really focus on different groups of orchids can pick some out. You know, even with kind of my limited knowledge of some of them, I can pick out, say, a Brassivola nodosa hybrid because of the shape. And then within that, if it has spotting, I could say, okay, that's probably from Richard Mueller, you know, which is a hybrid with Laelia milleri, and just kind of go from there. Orchid folks also use different databases sometimes to look at flowering time. And I showed kind of that one slide of the pedigree, the different percentages within one hybrid. I hadn't thought of it before, but there's now folks who are using that information based on the parents. And when you see the plant flowering, to figure out, okay, you know, plants that flower around this time of year tend to be from these species. Does it look more like that species or another? But and I hate to say this, especially to students, there's also just a lot of Googling that goes on and trying to kind of look at the flower and sort of compare it. A lot of times, if it's something that's pretty widely spread, it's one that's already been cloned and is pretty widely known within the trade. But, you know, there's always a few unusual ones out there.
Okay, another question. Really, you'll be bombarded with a lot of questions because I think we have participants here. I know some of them would be in molecular biology. There would be hobbies, a lot would be students. We have faculty members also. We have stematists here. Okay, so next question is that given that there are a number of orchid hybrids that have been developed, one would expect that there would be a high number of studies on species relationship. Yet, when it comes to molecular genetic research, orchids are not used as much as other plants. Why do you think so?
I have to preface this by saying I am not skilled in molecular genetics, and so I defer to other people's knowledge. One thing I think that's been a large challenge with orchids is, as I mentioned, they're rather slow growing. And so it can be, for one thing, hard to start doing things that we think of with other faster growing plants. Like if we wanted to create a population where we're breeding two different types together, then have a segregating population that we use, something like genome-wide associated selections or that sort of thing with, you're looking at years and years of development well outside of like a graduate student's program. I think that's part of it. I also think there tends to unfortunately be a large bias in academia and in a lot of publishing towards non-tropical plants. And I see this changing, but you know, it's a lot harder for folks in well-funded labs in temperate areas to grow some of these orchids and do the studies. And so we're relying instead on other labs that, you know, might not have the funding or some of the other resources to grow up some of these large numbers. And that really is, I think, the thing, when you're looking at molecular genetics, you're trying to narrow things down to a, small genome level, is you want, kind of these wide numbers. That being said, I see things changing. I know, as I mentioned, with Taiwan or with Japan, that they've done some work looking at relationships. Taiwan has funded a lot of research into orchids, both at the molecular genetics level and at breeding. And there's different programs that are starting to crop up. And I'm hopeful that as more kind of folks get interested in it, and the kind of time period goes on, you'll see more of those kind of developing.
Another question here. Curious question from Justin Badlis. Do breeders have depositories or banks for seeds to preserve their hybrids? Or do breeders have other methods to ensure their hybrid will not be wiped out due to various circumstances? Example, sharing with other breeders in different locations.
This is a great question, and it's something where I think in theory, it would be great to see more of this. In practice, breeders, for whatever reason, sometimes can be a kind of secretive lot and sort of hold on to plants. That being said, I'm seeing more and more work being done on preserving important species and preserving important hybrids. For a while, I saw folks selling seeds of different orchids online. And again, small number of, like a large number of orchid seeds is a small physical amount in terms of preserving it. There's folks selling them on eBay. There was also a seed group called, I think, B&T World Seed that for a while was selling orchids that are incredibly hard to find as plants, much less as seeds, and then keeping them backed up. Several orchid laboratories will also do backups of seed if you're having them germinate seed. Again, breeders don't always trust the laboratories, so there can be kind of some challenges with that, but it does happen. And I know Dr. Amore here had kind of run into this a few years ago. We had flooding at the near the university's greenhouses, and there was a large risk that some of these important hybrids that really are the backbone of the local orchid industry might be lost. Fortunately, they'd worked with another group to do tissue culture backups of some of these hybrids. Tissue culture has some challenges. There's some potential for mutation, but a lot of them have been kind of passed around. I'd like to see more of this though, and I know I was looking actually recently at the gene bank for the US through our Department of Agriculture. I think there are a handful of orchids there, but not many. And again, thinking in terms of space, you could back up thousands of orchids in about the space between my hands. So I hope to see more of that going on in the future.
Thank you. Another question from another student, Jeffrey Cruzada. Good day, Dr. Keach. I would like to ask if there are ideal conditions for maximal orchid growth. And the second question is, are there differences in terms of lifespan between wild type and bred orchids?
So I'll address that second one first. So there's some ongoing debate about this. A lot of folks I know have said that wild collected plants sometimes are better adapted because they're, been under really tough conditions, typically not ideal. On the other hand, for species that are difficult to grow, under normal circumstances, I've had some way more knowledgeable orchid growers and breeders than myself tell me that they prefer to put a difficult species into a flask and grow it up from seed, because then, for one thing, they can select among these, hundreds of thousands of offspring for the best growing individuals. And when they pull them out, have a number that they can select under their conditions. So unfortunately, I don't have a kind of clear answer with that. And in terms of lifespan, orchids, what I was always told is that orchids are near immortal. And I haven't seen good documentation for this. I know there is one orchid in the Singapore Botanic Gardens. It's, I believe, the oldest documented orchid that's 150 years old. But given good conditions, a lot of orchids will keep kind of growing perpetually and might go through kind of dormant cycles, but can continue on. In terms of ideal growth conditions, it depends a lot on the orchid. And so if you're looking at hybrids, again, they've mostly been selected under, cultivated conditions, so they tend to be a little more forgiving. Species, really doing your background reading and seeing where the species is native to can make a big difference. There was a famous breeder and grower here in Hawaii, Moyer, who had relatively small yard, but had an incredible range of different species. And what he had done was look for all the little microclimates around his yard. Where's, the wind the strongest, which part gets the most rain, which part gets the most shade, kind of grown accordingly. So that's good if you're kind of looking for kind of these harder to grow species or for a wide range of them. If you're looking for commercial, I think, again, looking into what the ancestry is. Another thing that I don't hear brought up a lot by commercial growers, but I've seen in practice more and more, is potting according to the root growth. I think a lot of orchid people fall behind on repotting, and I'm certainly guilty of that myself. Talking to some commercial growers, they said that repotting an orchid as its roots are just reaching the edge of the pot, and then kind of continuing that practice lets them kind of keep up a faster growth pace. I haven't had a chance to, go and investigate this. I believe they were growing cymbidiums with that, but it might be worth checking out. But yeah, I will say, compared to a lot of other plants, I find orchids very forgiving because they tend to have a lot of storage organs. So, certainly give them a shot, make some mistakes, and, see what you learn from that as well.
Okay, thank you. Another question from Matthew Ray Summer. Are orchids and or hybrid ones indicators of what in the ecosystem?
So orchids, as I mentioned in terms of their seeds in the wild, orchid seeds tend to not carry a lot of energy reserves. They tend to carry a few complex molecules rather than lots of like starches or sugars, but they also tend to form really good relationships with fungi that help break down these complex storage molecules. So I would say, from that point of view alone, orchids tend to require some degree of fungal diversity and conditions that are good for fungal growth. In other things, orchids can play around, with different sort of species. They tend to be very specialized in terms of pollinators. So they can be a really good indicator of that specific species that pollinates them. They're not something that has, say, a really wide range of pollinators. So it's sort of harder to say. One other thing I think is people can sometimes think of orchids as being parasitic because you see them growing on the outside of a plant, and they're not. Typically what they're doing is they're just using it as kind of a place to secure themselves. So, there's not necessarily a thing that if an orchid's growing well, that means the plant under it is growing well. It might just be that it was where that seed happened to land. But yeah, they definitely play an active role in ecosystems. And there are, I should mention, even invasive orchids out there as well.
Okay, thank you. Another question here from Rod Selching, a student. With regards to breeding, is it possible to breed an orchid with a non-orchid? Will the offspring be classified as part of hybrid orchid? That's the question.
Ooh, I will say, if any group of plants can do it, it would be orchids. They, really kind of throw our concept of a species or genus out the window. Right now, the limit seems to be tribes within orchids, and I don't believe there's been hybrids within different tribes within the orchid family. That being said, I mean, orchids, I gave a talk recently about orchids and mentioned that they're in the order Asparagales. And, you know, in my lifetime, seeing them change from folks thinking they were more closely related to lilies to thinking folks thinking they're, you know, closely related to asparagus or relatively closely related. I don't know enough in terms of some of the differences within kind of the order Asparagales to say what might be, you know, a group they could hybridize with. I remember seeing a paper saying they were pretty far on the periphery, but again, if any group of plants is going to do it, orchids are going to do it. And, you know, I would certainly say try it out. I've seen some orchid hybrids that I thought were impossible, but that were being made by people who didn't know they couldn't do it. And so, you know, made that cross. So, you know, by all means, please go out and adventure.
Okay, last question before we wrap up, and that will be from me. Very interesting. This is something to, you know, related to the work that I do as a curator. You know, we as a curator, we have regards to species name, species name, updating of species name. Then we have plant identification. We have to come up with the right, with the correct species identification. Mostly, if this would be botanical species, very easy, you know, when you have to look for the updated names, because we have the Plants of the World online, the Global Flora online, and then we do also have our very own cost digital flora of the Philippines. But these are what we call as the botanical species. And sometimes we have students, you know, because we, as part of our role, we have to, I mean, not authenticate, but verify species name. No? Some of them would come to us, especially for those hybrids. You know, this is really very difficult for me when it comes to not just orchid hybrids, but there are also several hybrids. So sometimes they will have to ask for the, you know, the author of the hybrid. If this is actually a cultivar, a cultivated hybrid, it's really very difficult. So that's why we always answer them that we can only give the author citation for the species. But when it becomes, when that species now bred with another species, like for example, in the ones that you have mentioned, you know, we have no way of looking at a particular taxonomic database where we can check. Now, do you still use the, I mean, the rules in nomenclature of cultivated plants, no, cultivars, is still governed by the IUCN, I mean, the International Code of Nomenclature for Cultivated Plants. I think, do you use that? You know, when you have to come up with names of your cultivated hybrids.
I've used it directly, and I think it's still viewed as the final authority on orchid species names. And there's, especially within the last 10, 20 years, been a lot of things which were formerly considered varieties within a species or subspecies being split into new species. For the orchids are interesting in that the contemporary sort of taxonomic changes aren't always reflected in the database of pedigrees. And that's maintained kind of directly through the Royal Horticultural Society in the UK. They, every once in a while, will go and kind of revise some names. There was a big shakeup 10 years ago, I think, with changing a lot of the Cattleya species and kind of lumping them together. But that, for hybrids, tends to be the authority that we use when we're making references. And you can search their database by the name, or you can also search by the two parents to see what egrecs will be named. And then I've seen that used as a reference. It gets a little complicated when something that was one species is now renamed as another, and a hybrid has been created. There's a lot of duplicates now. And I will say the Royal Horticultural Society's website is not made for ease of use. It's there's been a few efforts to kind of create other databases. The American Orchid Society maintains a hybrid database. And there's also a third-party software called Orchid, which I use, but is rather expensive. A non-educational license is $300 a year, US. Yeah, and education. Yeah, I was just about passed out when I saw that. an educational license is typically half that, which is still more than I pay for pretty much any other software license. But I have heard that they're willing to work with different educational groups. The nice thing, it does get updated, I think quarterly, and it typically lists the references for different names. So a lot of times I'll use that and see what it has to say, recognizing that something might have happened in the past quarter. There's a website called orchidroots.com that bases their database off of the Royal Horticultural Society database. And there's some bugs in the site, but it's free and it's accessible off a phone, which is great if you're kind of on the go. And they'll list synonyms, they list sort of subspecies and varieties as well. So I've started using that as kind of a way to get a general idea and then working backwards from it. But yeah, IUCN, I think, is kept much more up to date, but in terms of within the orchid world, we tend to be a little slower and rely on the RHS database. Awesome, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Keach. Yeah, very, very informative, really. I think we get some of these participants here, especially the students, to go into orchid breeding. But this time we'll use Philippine species. Okay. Kuya Floor.
Yes.
And,
Thank you very much.
turning
Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Ma'am Prof. Hadsal and Dr. Keach. And of course, to all of you, our dear audience, for an engaging forum. Again, congratulations, Dr. Keach, for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you all again for inviting me, and thank you everyone for attending. This is really fun to talk about. So
Okay.
appreciate you giving me that platform.
Thank you. And before I proceed to our closing, let me just share my screen. So on behalf of our director, Dr. Marian P. De Leon, we will be awarding this certificate to our resource person. And it states, University of the Philippines, Los Baños, UPLB Museum of Natural History, awards this certificate of appreciation to Dr. James Keach for serving as our resource person during the UPLB Museum of Natural History's Biodiversity Seminar on Orchid Diversity as Captured Through Breeding, held today, August 23, 2022, from 9:30 to 11 a.m. Philippine Standard Time via Zoom, and signed by our director, Dr. Marian P. De Leon. Congratulations, Sir James Keach.
My sincerest thanks.
So I'm inviting everyone, our audience, to visit our website. It's at mnh.uplb.edu.ph. If you have some questions or follow-up queries, you could email us at mnh.uplb@up.edu.ph. We are on social media. We are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Just look for the account UPLB Museum, and we will be uploading the edited recording of this webinar possibly by tomorrow morning on our YouTube channel. Check out our article at Wikipedia and TripAdvisor. Just look for UPLB Museum of Natural History. So friends, thank you again for being with us in this webinar. Please stay tuned on our Facebook channels for further announcements on our next webinar. So yun lang po. Maraming salamat. Thank you very much. And always keep safe. James, thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Salamat po. Thank
Salamat
you.
po. Bye.
Thank you, James. Bye.
Thank you.